Arrest him. He's trespassing on HOA property.
Vanessa Cole said that while an excavator tore through my land and 3 dump trucks buried the drainage ditch behind my house, she called it a filthy mosquito pit. Then she laughed as the machine crushed the reeds my late wife had documented for 15 years. I showed her the property marker. She kicked dirt over it and told the crew to keep going. So I stopped arguing. I photographed every truck, saved every message, and pulled the one county record Vanessa had never bothered to read. 3 weeks later, she invited the local news to unveil her new gazebo. She was holding the ribbon-cutting scissors when 4 official vehicles turned onto the grass. Vanessa was still smiling, until the first door opened. 3 weeks earlier, I had come home from a routine heart appointment and heard diesel engines behind my house. At first, I assumed the county was clearing a fallen tree. Then I saw the first dump truck raise its bed. A wall of dirt slid straight into my drainage ditch. 2 more trucks were waiting behind it. An excavator was already tearing through the reeds and young willow trees along the bank. Vanessa Cole stood beside the machine in white boots and designer sunglasses, holding her HOA clipboard like it was a court order. Behind her, someone had planted a new sign in the ground. Coming soon. The Vanessa Cole Community Overlook. I walked toward the excavator operator and raised one hand. Shut it down. You're working on private property. The operator looked toward Vanessa. She stepped between us. This is not private property anymore, she said. The board approved a community beautification project. I pointed toward the iron survey marker beside her boot. My property line starts right there. She glanced down. Then she scraped loose dirt over the marker with her heel and smiled. Water from our neighborhood passes through this trench. That gives the HOA control over it. That was not how property law worked, and it definitely was not how drainage rights worked. Before I could answer, the excavator bucket came down again. It crushed a patch of reeds where my wife, Ellen, used to photograph tree frogs every spring. I pulled out my phone and began recording. Vanessa noticed. Then she turned toward the workers. "Keep going," she shouted. "He'll be gone as soon as the police arrive." The deputies arrived 8 minutes later. Vanessa reached them before I did. "He's been threatening my workers," she said. "He refuses to leave HOA property." I was standing less than 30 feet from my own back porch. One deputy asked me to move away from the machinery. I did. Then I retrieved a folded copy of my deed from the glove compartment of my truck. "This ditch is inside my parcel," I said. "The HOA has no ownership here." Vanessa immediately produced a subdivision map. A blue line across the page was labeled Drainage Corridor. She tapped it with one polished fingernail. "There, Community Infrastructure." The deputy studied both documents. Then he shook his head. "I can't settle a property dispute beside a ditch. Nobody touches anybody, and you handle ownership through the county." Vanessa smiled as though he had ruled in her favor. She ordered the excavator to continue. A crew member placed temporary construction fencing between my yard and the worksite, cutting me off from part of my own property. Then Vanessa looked at my old pickup truck and lowered her voice. "You can't afford to fight the association, Daniel. Stop making this difficult." I did not answer. The deputy's body camera had already recorded her admitting that I claimed the property and ordering the work to continue anyway. That night, I opened the steel document box my father had left me. At the bottom was a yellow envelope marked Wetland and Flood Control Records. Do not discard. Inside was a faded county map, several inspection reports, and an agreement my father had signed almost 40 years earlier. He bought this land before the subdivision existed. When the developer began clearing the hillside, Its engineers asked for permission to fill the low ground behind his house. My father refused. He understood something Vanessa never did. That narrow channel carried stormwater away from the entire slope. Before the subdivision, the hillside had been mostly trees and open ground. Rain soaked into the soil gradually. After construction, water poured from roofs, driveways, sidewalks, and paved streets. The natural channel behind our house became even more important. Years later, I became a county drainage engineer. I spent 31 years inspecting culverts, calculating runoff, mapping flood routes, and explaining to developers why water always remembers where it used to flow. Ellen understood the other half of the ditch. She taught elementary science and kept a small green notebook filled with photographs and dates. Tree frogs in April, turtles near the bank, migrating birds resting in the reeds, native flowers appearing after the spring rains. She also recorded water levels after major storms. After cancer took her, I kept adding to the notebook every spring. Watching Vanessa's excavator destroy those reeds felt like losing Ellen twice. I unfolded the oldest map across my kitchen table. The channel was outlined in blue. Beside it was an official county stamp and 5 words that changed the entire dispute. Seasonal wetland. No fill without review. Vanessa believed she had buried an ugly trench. According to that file, she had buried something the HOA had no authority to touch. The next morning, I took the map to the county records office. A clerk pulled my parcel file and confirmed what I already suspected. The entire drainage channel sat inside my property line. My land had never been added to the HOA. There was no recorded easement giving the association ownership or control. Then she searched the permit database. There was no approval for a gazebo. No grading permit. No environmental review. And no authorization to dump fill material into the wetland. While I was standing at the counter, my phone buzzed. Vanessa had sent me an official HOA violation notice. It accused me of interfering with community drainage, threatening authorized contractors, and blocking emergency access. The penalty was $500 a day. I read it twice. Then I sent one question. Which recorded covenant gives your association authority over my property? Vanessa never answered. Instead, an HOA attorney sent me a letter warning that continued interference could result in additional fines, legal action, and a lien against my property. A lien from an HOA I had never joined. The county clerk watched me slide the letter into my folder. Then she turned back toward her computer. Mr. Mercer, there's another document attached to your parcel. She rotated the screen toward me. It was signed by your father. The document was a drainage agreement created when the subdivision was first approved. Vanessa had been right about one thing. The original developer had permission to send controlled stormwater through my father's property. But permission to use the natural flow did not mean ownership. The agreement stated that my father retained full title to the land. The developer, and any future HOA, was required to keep the channel open and preserve its existing grade. They could not widen it, redirect it, bury it, or place permanent structures over it without the owner's written consent and an environmental review. There was also a liability clause. If the association blocked the channel and caused flooding or ecological damage, the association would be responsible for restoring the property. Vanessa's drainage corridor map did not give her control. It proved the HOA had a duty not to do exactly what she had done. I requested a certified copy and began building a binder. Ownership records, wetland maps, construction photographs, police reports, permit searches, every letter and email Vanessa had sent. I was no longer preparing for an argument. I was building a timeline. At 2:13 the following morning, my security camera sent an alert. 2 more dump trucks had entered my property. This time they were working in the dark. I watched the camera feed from my kitchen. The trucks had covered their company logos with black plastic, but the drivers had forgotten about their license plates. I saved every frame, called the sheriff's non-emergency line, and created another incident report. I did not walk outside. By sunrise, the drainage channel had nearly disappeared. The crew had buried a narrow plastic pipe beneath the new ground. They claimed it would carry stormwater safely under the gazebo. I measured the opening from behind the temporary fence. 12 inches. That pipe was supposed to carry runoff from an entire developed hillside. I had spent 31 years calculating water flow. It would not survive one serious storm. I emailed Vanessa, the board, their attorney, and the contractor. The installed pipe is dangerously undersized. Continued filling may cause water to back up into the neighborhood. Vanessa replied 11 minutes later. You are retired, Daniel. Your professional opinions are no longer relevant. Stop interfering with licensed contractors. I printed the email and placed it in my binder. Then I searched the contractor's business records. The company had received a $78,000 HOA contract without competitive bidding. Its owner was Marcus Cole, Vanessa's brother-in-law. This was no longer simply an illegal gazebo. Vanessa was spending HOA money on a family contractor, using my property to improve the view from nearby homes, and ignoring a written flood warning to keep the project moving. That afternoon, my phone issued a severe weather alert. A slow-moving storm system was expected to drop several inches of rain within 48 hours. I looked through the fence at that 12-inch pipe. Vanessa thought she had buried the evidence. But water has a way of bringing buried mistakes back to the surface. The rain started just before midnight. By 1 in the morning, water was pouring from the roofs and paved streets above my property, following the same route it had taken for decades. Only now, the route was gone. Mud, leaves, and broken branches packed themselves against Vanessa's pipe within minutes. The water began rising behind the new gazebo. At 1:40, the first HOA street flooded. By 2-3 backyards were underwater. Brown water pushed through a basement window, covered the playground in mud, and began cutting away the fresh soil beneath one corner of the gazebo. I put on my raincoat and walked along the edge of my property with a flashlight and camera. I recorded the blocked pipe, the rising water, and the current moving around the new concrete foundation. Then I heard an elderly neighbor shouting for help. His wife's car was still parked in their lower driveway. I helped them move it uphill. Then I carried my portable pump into their basement. They had supported Vanessa's project. That did not mean I was going to stand outside and watch their home flood. Vanessa arrived in her SUV shortly before dawn. She looked at the water covering the street and announced that the neighborhood had been struck by an unprecedented storm. It had not. The county rain gauge showed less than 3 inches. That was well within the volume the original channel had carried many times before. I showed her the reading. She looked at the collapsed soil beneath the gazebo and then at the residents recording her with their phones. "This has nothing to do with our project," she said. The storm had not exposed a natural disaster. It had exposed a man-made obstruction. But Vanessa still had another lie ready. At 8 that morning, she emailed the entire neighborhood and blamed the flooding on me. Her message claimed that I had failed to maintain my private drainage ditch. She said the HOA had stepped in only after years of neglect. Then she announced that the association's attorney was preparing a damage claim against me. I replied with 2 photographs. The first showed the channel carrying water safely 6 months earlier. The second showed her contractors burying that same channel beneath truckloads of dirt. I copied the entire board. Vanessa never addressed the photographs. Instead, she announced that the gazebo's ribbon cutting would proceed on Saturday as planned. She needed the project to appear successful before residents started asking where their money had gone. That evening, someone knocked on my back door. It was Ruth Alvarez, the HOA's former secretary. She carried a flash drive and a folder of meeting minutes. "The board never approved that project," she said. The original records showed that Vanessa had authorized the contract herself, signed multiple change orders, and ordered the crews to continue after I objected. 2 board members who supported the gazebo were preparing to sell homes overlooking the site. A new community landmark would raise their asking prices. Then Ruth showed me an email Vanessa had sent after my first warning. It read, "Once the dirt is in, no agency is going to make us take it back out." Vanessa believed completing the gazebo would make the damage permanent. I saved the email and added it to my binder. Then I sent the entire evidence package to the regional office of the Environmental Protection Agency. Before the EPA could take formal action, however, it needed more than an old map and my professional opinion. So I called Dr. Maya Patel, a licensed wetland ecologist I had worked with during my years at the county. She inspected the exposed edges of the site and collected soil samples without crossing the construction fence. Within an hour, she found hydric soil beneath the fresh fill, buried wetland vegetation, and signs that frogs had been breeding along the original channel. Then she pointed toward the gazebo foundation. Water was already forcing its way around the concrete. "The wetland is still functioning," she said. "They didn't eliminate it, they only buried it." Some of the fill contained crushed asphalt and broken concrete, material that should never have been dumped there without review. I sent the EPA everything. My deed, the certified drainage agreement, the wetland map, security footage, rainfall records, Vanessa's emails, Ruth's original meeting minutes, and Maya's preliminary report. The next morning, an investigator called me. He asked only 3 questions. Who owned the land? Who ordered the fill? And when was the ribbon cutting? I answered all 3. Vanessa never learned about that call. She spent the rest of the week decorating the gazebo and inviting the local news to celebrate what she called a new landmark for our community. Saturday morning, Vanessa covered the gazebo in blue and white balloons. A brass plaque had been mounted beside the entrance. The Vanessa Cole Community Overlook. Board members gathered beneath it with coffee and matching HOA badges. Marcus stood beside his equipment, smiling near the structure his company had been paid $78,000 to build. The local news had positioned a camera beside the ribbon. Vanessa wore a white suit and spoke as though the project had rescued the neighborhood. She said the HOA had eliminated a safety hazard, improved stormwater drainage, and transformed abandoned land into a beautiful community space. Nobody mentioned the flooded basements. Nobody mentioned the missing permits. And nobody mentioned that the gazebo was standing on my property. I waited outside the temporary fence with my binder under one arm. Vanessa saw me and smiled toward the television camera. "Some people resist progress," she said, "because they don't understand community responsibility." Several board members laughed. Then she raised the oversized scissors. Before the blades reached the ribbon, 4 vehicles turned off the road and crossed the wet grass. The first carried an EPA enforcement officer. The second belonged to the state water agency. Behind them came a county stormwater engineer and a licensed surveyor. The crowd went quiet. Vanessa lowered the scissors but kept smiling. I'm sure this is only a misunderstanding." The EPA officer walked past her, looked beneath the gazebo, and pressed his boot into the wet soil. Then he turned toward the open news microphone. "Who authorized the placement of fill material in this wetland?" For the first time since the trucks arrived, Vanessa had no prepared answer. She recovered quickly. Then she pointed at Marcus. The contractor handled all permits. The board only approved a beautification project. Marcus stared at her. He had spent 3 weeks following her instructions, and now she was offering him to the investigators. "That's not what happened," he said. He unlocked his phone and opened their message thread. Vanessa had ordered him to add more fill after my first complaint. She had told him to send trucks after dark. And she had written, "Finish before Saturday. Once the ribbon is cut, Daniel won't be able to stop us." The reporter moved closer. Vanessa tried to take the phone, but the EPA officer stepped between them. Then Ruth walked out of the crowd. She handed over the original board minutes and explained that no lawful vote had ever approved the gazebo. Vanessa had signed the contract herself. She had also approved every change order paid to her brother-in-law's company. I opened my binder. The first page was my deed. The second was the certified drainage agreement. Then came the wetland map, the photographs, the security footage, the rainfall records, the flood videos, the permit searches, and every warning Vanessa had ignored. The surveyor walked to the edge of the gazebo and located the old iron property marker Vanessa had covered with dirt. He placed a bright orange flag beside it. The entire structure was inside my parcel. The county engineer crouched near the buried pipe. "This opening cannot carry the design flow from that hillside," he said. "The fill created the obstruction that caused last week's flooding." Maya showed the investigators where wetland plants had been buried beneath the new soil. Water was still rising through cracks beside the concrete foundation. The EPA officer issued an immediate stop work order. A red notice was attached to the gazebo before Vanessa ever cut the ribbon. She read it and shook her head. "You cannot seriously expect us to remove an entire structure over a muddy ditch." The officer looked directly at her. "The structure is the reason the violation is continuing." Then he explained what the HOA would be required to do. "Remove the gazebo. Break apart the concrete foundation. Excavate every load of unauthorized fill. Transport the contaminated material away. Restore the original elevation and water channel. Replant native wetland vegetation. And hire qualified specialists to monitor the site until the ecosystem recovered." Vanessa's expression changed as each requirement was read aloud. The first restoration estimate came back at $167,000. She told the board that number was impossible, but the estimate did not include environmental penalties. It did not include attorney fees. It did not include the flooded basements. And it did not include the financial audit that had just been opened into her contract with Marcus. The gazebo had taken 3 weeks to build. The order requiring its removal took less than 20 minutes. Demolition began 12 days later. Vanessa did not attend. I watched from my back porch as workers removed the blue and white decorations, unscrewed the brass plaque bearing her name, and dismantled the gazebo one section at a time. Then the excavator returned. Only this time, the bucket was not burying the ditch. It was digging it back out. The concrete foundation had to be broken into pieces and hauled away. Every truckload of dirt was inspected because some of the fill contained crushed asphalt and construction debris. Engineers used the old survey elevations to reconstruct the original channel. Maya supervised the placement of native grasses, reeds, and wetland plants. Monitoring wells were installed so the EPA and state inspectors could confirm that water was moving through the soil naturally again. The HOA had buried the ditch in 3 weeks. Restoring it correctly took almost 6 months. And the invoices kept arriving. $92,000 for demolition, excavation and removal. $54,000 for ecological restoration. $31,000 for engineering, surveying and long-term monitoring. $28,000 in penalties and agency fees. $25,000 in legal expenses. And another $20,000 for insurance deductibles and damage caused by the flooding. The final total was exactly what Vanessa had said no agency could ever force them to spend. $250,000. The financial audit made things worse for her. Investigators confirmed that Vanessa had never disclosed her family relationship with Marcus. She had approved his contract without competitive bids, authorized additional payments without a valid board vote, and used HOA funds to improve the view from homes belonging to her political allies. At an emergency meeting, residents voted to remove her as president. Marcus lost the restoration work and was barred from future HOA contracts. Every violation notice and fine sent to me was withdrawn. The new board adopted rules requiring public votes for major projects, independent permit reviews, and full disclosure whenever a board member's family might profit from HOA spending. It also acknowledged in writing that my property was outside the association's authority. I could have demanded that the restored land be fenced off from the entire neighborhood. Instead, I allowed the local elementary school to use a small observation path outside the protected area. No concrete, no gazebo. Just a narrow wooden walkway and a sign explaining how wetlands reduce flooding and provide habitat. The school digitized Ellen's green notebook and used her photographs in its science program. The following spring, I walked down to the channel after the first warm rain. Water moved quietly through the reeds. A pair of turtles rested near the bank. Then I heard tree frogs calling from the place the excavator had once buried. I opened Ellen's notebook and added one final line beneath her last entry. The water found its way home. Vanessa thought authority came from a title, a clipboard, and a board willing to repeat whatever she said. I knew real authority came from ownership, evidence, and the patience to document every lie. The HOA spent 3 weeks burying that ditch. It took 6 months and $250,000 to teach them that it had never belonged to them. What would you have done if an HOA buried a protected wetland on your property, flooded the neighborhood, and then tried to fine you for objecting? Was removing Vanessa from the board enough? Or should she have been personally responsible for part of that $250,000 bill instead of leaving every homeowner to pay for her decision? Tell me what you think in the comments. And if you have ever dealt with an HOA president who confused a title with ownership, share your story. Because a clipboard may look official, but it will never outrank a deed, a public record, and the truth.